9 years they called me the Freeloader. 9 years I was the only name on the invoices. Then the hospice called. I remember the exact sound the phone made that Tuesday morning. A soft double buzz against the kitchen counter while I was rinsing out my coffee mug. And I remember how my hand went still when I saw the number on the screen. Brookhaven's main line. On a morning I had not called them. A call I did not expect. "Claire, it's Marisol, calling from Brookhaven. It's about your mother. Eleanor has been moved to hospice care. She's been asking for you, specifically, by name. There's something she wants you to help her finish, and she asked me to make sure you heard it from her, not from anyone else in the family." I stood there in my kitchen, with the water still running, and I did not breathe for what felt like a very long time. 6 months of silence. 6 months of a phone number that had been blocked from both directions. And now a nurse's voice was telling me my mother wanted something from me again. After everything. After 9 years of being told I was nothing but a burden with a checkbook. After the words freeloader had been thrown at me so many times, it had practically become my legal name in that family. My mother wanted something from me. And God help me, some small, stupid, loyal part of me was already reaching for my car keys before I had even played the rest of the message. But I am getting ahead of myself. And if you are going to understand what that voicemail actually meant, and what it eventually cost the people who spent 9 years humiliating me, you need to go back with me to the beginning. Because this was never really a story about money, even though there was a great deal of money involved. This was a story about who shows up, and who simply expects to be shown up for. If you have ever been the one in your family who quietly carried everyone else, the one who paid and stayed and said nothing while your name got dragged through every holiday dinner, I want you to know that I am telling this story for you. Stay with me, because it does not end the way they thought it would. It started 9 years ago. In the spring, my father died. His name was Frank Whitfield, and he was the kind of man who fixed things quietly, who never raised his voice, who believed that a handshake mattered more than a contract. He had a massive heart attack on a Sunday morning while he was clearing leaves out of the gutter, and by the time the paramedics got him to the hospital, there was nothing left for anyone to do but say goodbye. I was 34 years old, and I held his hand in a hospital hallway that smelled like bleach and burnt coffee, and I promised him, right there, that I would take care of my mother. He could not hear me anymore by then, but I said it out loud anyway, because I meant it with everything I had. My mother, Eleanor, did not take the loss well. Within a year, she had been diagnosed with a form of vascular dementia that the doctors said would only progress, and within 18 months, she could no longer safely live alone in the house where I had grown up. That was when the real math of the family started to show itself, because grief has a way of revealing exactly who someone is underneath their good manners. My brother, Robert, was 2 years older than me and had built a comfortable life selling luxury real estate in the same town we grew up in, with a wife named Vanessa who drove a car worth more than my first house, and a habit of describing anything under $500,000 as starter. My sister, Paige, had married a wealth manager named Grant and moved into a life that looked, from the outside, like something out of a catalog. All white marble counters and seasonal wardrobe changes. Between the two of them, they had more disposable income in a single month than I earned in 3. And yet, when the bills started arriving, first for the care that kept her in her own house, and then for the memory care facility, $6,000 a month in those first years, and $6,850 by the end, before the medications and the supplies that were never once part of anyone else's arithmetic. Every single month, it was my name that ended up on every invoice. I want to be precise about this, because precision was always my job before it became my armor. I worked as a senior compliance auditor for a regional healthcare insurance company, the kind of job where I spent my days finding the exact dollar amount that did not add up in someone else's paperwork. I am telling you that so you understand that when I say I was the only name on the invoices for 9 years, I do not mean that loosely. I mean I have the folder. I mean I kept every single receipt, every wire transfer, every automatic payment confirmation, because it was simply how my brain worked, and because some quiet, wounded part of me always suspected I would need it someday. In the beginning, I did not mind carrying it alone. Truly. My mother needed care, my father was gone, and someone had to step up. I told myself Robert and Paige were simply busy with their own families, their own lives, and that eventually they would come around and help share the weight. What I did not expect was that instead of gratitude, what I would receive was a nickname. It started small, the way cruelty in families usually does. A comment at a birthday dinner. Paige laughing that I must have nothing better to do, since I was always the one driving Mom to appointments. Robert joking at Thanksgiving that I clearly liked playing martyr because I always offered to cover the difference when Mom's care costs increased. By the end of that first year, it had a name. They started calling me the Freeloader, openly, to my face, as though the person paying every single bill was somehow the one taking advantage of everyone else. "Oh, here comes St. Clair," Vanessa said once, at a 4th of July barbecue, loud enough for the whole backyard to hear. Coming to remind everyone how much she sacrifices for Mom, since she's clearly got nothing else going on in that empty little life of hers. I remember laughing along with them that day, because that was easier than admitting how deeply it cut. I remember going home and sitting in my car in the lot outside my building for 40 minutes before I could make myself go inside. The logic, when I finally understood it, was almost impressive in its cruelty. Because I did not have children, because I had never married, because I worked from home and set my own hours, my family had collectively decided that my time, my money, and my life simply mattered less than theirs. I was single. I was, in their eyes, unencumbered, which somehow meant I existed to be used. My mother, in those early years before the dementia fully took hold, should have defended me. She did not. If anything, she reinforced it, laughing along with Robert's jokes, telling her friends at the facility how lucky she was that Claire didn't have much else keeping her busy. I do not think she meant it as cruelty exactly. I think, if I am being generous, she genuinely believed that a woman without a husband or children had less of a life to protect. But generosity has its limits, and by year 5, I had stopped being generous in my private accounting of who this family actually was. There is one person I need to tell you about here, because she is the reason any of what follows matters at all. My niece, Sophie, Robert and Vanessa's daughter, was 6 years old when my father died, and something in her simply attached itself to me in those early grieving months. She would climb into my lap at family dinners and ask me to tell her stories about Grandpa Frank, about the birdhouses he used to build, about the way he whistled off-key while he mowed the lawn. While the adults around us traded barbed comments about who was doing enough and who was doing too little, Sophie was the one constant, warm thing in that entire family. She never once called me a freeloader. Not once, in 9 years. I held on to that. I want you to remember her, because she matters more than almost anyone else in this story, and because everything I eventually built, I built partly for her. By year 6, the invoices had grown, my mother's needs had grown, and my patience, quietly, steadily, had begun running out. But I did not know yet just how far my family was willing to go to make sure I stayed exactly where they wanted me. In their minds, small, useful, and endlessly available. What I did not know yet was that the breaking point was already loading itself into the chamber, and it would arrive on a cold Thursday in November, at a Thanksgiving table set for 7. I did not know yet that my own mother would laugh in my face. I did not know yet that my own brother would be the one to end it first, on purpose, to prove a point. And I certainly did not know that 6 months of silence would end with a phone call from a hospice room that would hand me everything they had spent 9 years insisting I did not deserve. But we are not there yet. First, you need to understand exactly how it broke. The Thanksgiving that ended everything fell on a cold, gray day, the kind where the sky sits low and colorless over everything. And I remember arriving at Paige's house with a homemade pumpkin pie balanced on my knee because my hands were too full of grocery bags to hold it any other way. I had, as usual, paid for that month's increase in Mom's care costs 3 days earlier, an extra $400 a month, because the facility had added a new medication management fee. I had not mentioned it to anyone. I never did anymore. I had simply learned to absorb these things quietly. The way you learn to walk around a piece of furniture you have stopped noticing is even there. Dinner started normally enough. Grant made a toast to family. Vanessa complimented Paige's centerpiece. Robert talked, at some length, about a waterfront property he had just listed for $2.3 million. And then, somewhere between the turkey and the pie, my mother, sitting at the head of the table in the wheelchair she now needed full-time, looked directly at me and said, in front of everyone, "You know, Claire, it's a good thing you never had kids or a husband. At least this way you have time to be useful to somebody." The table went quiet. That particular kind of quiet where everyone is waiting to see whether the joke will be allowed to land. Robert laughed first. Then Vanessa. Then, God help her, Paige. "She's not wrong," Robert said, wiping his mouth with his napkin like he had just delivered a compliment. "I mean, somebody's got to be the freeloader who handles all that stuff. Might as well be you, right? Not like you've got much else going on." 9 years of that word. 9 years of watching them build entire vacations, entire kitchen renovations, entire private school tuitions for their children, while I quietly wired money every single month for a mother who, at that exact moment, was laughing along with the people mocking the daughter paying her bills. Something in me simply stopped bending. I set my fork down very carefully. I remember the sound it made against the china. "I paid $400 extra this month," I said, my voice steadier than I expected it to be. "Because Mom's medication management fee went up. Neither of you has contributed a single dollar to her care in 6 years. Not one. I have the records." The table went silent in a different way this time. "Oh, here we go," Paige said, rolling her eyes, reaching for her wine glass with the particular weariness of someone who has decided in advance that whatever you are about to say does not deserve to be heard. "Don't turn this into a whole thing, Claire. You always have to turn everything into a whole thing." "I am not turning anything into anything," I said. "I am telling you the truth. At a table where my mother just called me a freeloader for paying every single one of her bills for 9 years. My voice cracked slightly on the word freeloader, and I hated myself for it. Hated that after everything, they could still find the exact place that hurt. My mother, to her credit, or perhaps to her great discredit, did not apologize. She laughed. A short, dismissive laugh, the kind you give a child who is overreacting to a scraped knee. "Oh, don't be so dramatic," she said. "You'll be fine. You always figure it out. Besides," and here her voice took on the particular brightness of someone delivering what she believed was a joke. "You'll be back begging for a seat at this table by Christmas anyway. Where else would you go?" I remember the room very clearly in that moment. The candles Paige had lit for ambiance, the smell of cinnamon from the pie I had made. Sophie, 15 years old by then, sitting very still across the table, watching me with an expression I recognized because I had worn it myself, years earlier, at a different family dinner. Watching adults be cruel to someone who did not deserve it. "No," I said quietly. "I will not be back begging. I am done." I stood up. I did not raise my voice. I did not throw anything, though God knows some deeply buried part of me wanted to. I simply folded my napkin, set it beside my plate, and walked to the front hall to get my coat. Robert followed me, not to apologize, not even to argue. He followed me with his phone already out, already scrolling to my contact, and he said, loud enough for the whole house to hear, "You know what? Let's make this official." And right there, in Paige's front hallway, with his wife and sister and dying mother watching from the dining room, my own brother blocked my number. On purpose, in front of everyone. Like it was some kind of trophy he was claiming. "There," he said, holding up the screen so I could see it. "Now it's real. Good luck out there, freeloader." I remember the cold air outside hitting my face like something merciful. I remember sitting in my car in Paige's driveway for a long time before I could make my hands steady enough to drive. And I remember thinking, with a strange, quiet clarity that surprised me, that this was the first time in 9 years I had felt anything close to relief. What none of them understood, in that moment of small, ugly triumph, was that going no contact was not the punishment they believed it to be. It was the beginning of something they had never once considered possible. Because for 9 years, they had assumed my silence, my compliance, my endless willingness to pay and stay and swallow their cruelty was simply who I was. They had never once stopped to ask what I might become if I finally stopped absorbing it. They had no idea what 6 months of silence would actually cost them. The first few weeks of no contact were, if I am honest, harder than I expected. Not because I missed the way they treated me, but because silence has a particular kind of weight when you have spent 9 years organizing your entire life around other people's needs. I would reach for my phone out of habit, half expecting a text from Paige about a doctor's appointment I needed to coordinate, or one of Robert's clipped messages about something the family had already decided I would handle. And then remember, each time, that I had stepped away from all of it. Grief is a strange thing when it arrives for people who are still alive. But something else happened in those first quiet weeks, too. I started sleeping through the night for the first time in years. I stopped flinching every time my phone buzzed. And slowly, carefully, I started going back through the folder I had kept for 9 years, the one full of invoices and wire transfers and payment confirmations. Not because I needed it for anything in particular, but because looking at it, really looking at it, was the first time I let myself fully understand the shape of what I had been carrying. $685,000. That was the number I arrived at one Tuesday evening in December, sitting at my kitchen table with a calculator and 9 years of statements spread out in front of me like evidence at a trial. Nearly $700,000, paid in full, on time, every single month, by a woman her own family called a freeloader. I sat with that number for a long time. I did not cry. I had done enough of that already. I simply sat there, in the quiet of my own kitchen, and let the full weight of it settle into something harder than grief, something closer to clarity. There was one more thing in that folder, something I had almost forgotten about because I had filed it away years earlier without fully understanding its significance. A single sheet of paper, folded in thirds, tucked into the back pocket of the accordion file where I kept my father's old documents. A letter, in my father's handwriting, dated about 8 months before he died, addressed not to me, but to himself. The kind of note a careful man writes when he is quietly getting his affairs in order. In it, he mentioned a name I did not recognize at the time. Daniel Ferris, an elder law attorney downtown. The same attorney, it turned out, who had helped my parents draft their original estate documents decades earlier. I do not know exactly what made me pick up the phone and call that number, other than some instinct I could not fully explain. A feeling that my father, even from 9 years in the ground, was still quietly trying to take care of things. What I did not know yet, sitting there with that scrap of paper in my hand, was that this single decision, to call an attorney whose name I had found in my dead father's handwriting, would end up being the exact thread that unraveled everything my family had spent 9 years building on top of my silence. I called Daniel Ferris's office on a Wednesday afternoon, the 17th of January, a detail I remember only because I had written it in the corner of a legal pad before I dialed, as if I already understood, somewhere beneath conscious thought, that the date might matter someday. A receptionist answered on the second ring, her voice pleasant and unhurried in the particular way of someone who works in a quiet, well-run office. I gave her my name and my father's name, and told her, somewhat awkwardly, that I had found this number written in his handwriting on a piece of paper 8 months before he died 9 years earlier, and that I did not entirely know why I was calling. There was a pause on the other end of the line, longer than I expected, and then she said, carefully, "Let me check something. Can you hold for just a moment?" I sat in my kitchen, phone pressed to my ear, watching the steam rise off a mug of tea I had forgotten to drink, and when she came back, her voice had shifted into something more formal. "Mr. Ferris would like to speak with you directly if you have a few minutes. He asked me to interrupt his afternoon if a Whitfield ever called." I did not understand the weight of that sentence yet. I would not fully understand it for months, but something in the careful way she said it, if a Whitfield ever called, as though my family's name had been sitting on a shelf in that office for 9 years, waiting to be picked back up, made the back of my neck go cold in a way I could not explain. Daniel came on the line a moment later, his voice measured and unhurried, and told me only that he remembered my father well, that he would be glad to meet with me whenever it was convenient, and that there was no urgency, no fire to put out, simply some old business worth revisiting now that you've called. I scheduled a first meeting for 3 weeks out. I told myself it was nothing. Some small, careful part of me, the part that had learned 9 years earlier to expect disappointment rather than answers, refused to hope for anything more than a dusty old file and a polite handshake. I want to take you back further, though, before that phone call, before Thanksgiving, before any of it, because I think it matters that you understand exactly what those 9 years actually looked like, day by day, not just the number at the bottom of the ledger. My father was not a wealthy man. He worked 31 years as a shop foreman at a manufacturing plant 2 towns over, and what he left behind was not some grand fortune, but a paid-off house, a modest retirement account, and a habit, instilled in me from the time I was small, of writing everything down. "If it isn't written down, Claire," he used to say, standing over the workbench in that garage full of half-finished birdhouses, "it didn't happen. Not in any way that matters, not in any way you can prove." I did not know, when I was 12 years old and rolling my eyes at another one of his lectures about keeping receipts, that I was being trained, quietly and lovingly, for the exact fight that would define my 30s and 40s. There is a particular memory I return to often, from the 3rd year of caring for my mother, that I have never told anyone, not even Daniel Ferris. It was a Tuesday in October, and my mother's facility had called to say she needed a new set of compression stockings and a specific brand of thickened liquid for her swallowing difficulties, an unexpected expense of about $200 that month, on top of everything else. I remember sitting in my car outside a pharmacy, doing the math in my head, realizing that if I paid for it, I would not be able to cover my own car payment that month without dipping into a small emergency fund I had been trying, for years, to leave untouched. I paid for it anyway. I always paid for it anyway. And 2 weeks later, at a family dinner I almost did not attend because I was so exhausted, Robert made an offhand comment about a new set of golf clubs he had just bought. $1,100, he mentioned proudly, and when I stayed quiet, staring at my plate, Paige leaned over and said, not unkindly exactly, but not kindly either, "What's wrong with you tonight, Claire? You're always so tense. Must be nice not having a real job to stress about." I did not correct her that night. I rarely corrected anyone in those years. I had learned, the way people in difficult families often learn, that correcting the narrative simply invited more cruelty, sharper and more personal, until eventually I stopped defending myself altogether and simply absorbed it, the way you absorb weather, something you cannot control and eventually stop noticing. I think that is the part of this story I want you to sit with the longest, if you take nothing else from it. It was never really about the $200, or the $1,100, or even the $685,000 that number eventually became. It was about the particular, grinding loneliness of being the only person in a room who understood what something actually cost, while everyone around you spent freely and called you the burden. Sophie was 8 years old that October, and she was the only one at that dinner table who noticed I had gone quiet. I remember her sliding off her chair, walking around the table, and climbing into the seat beside me without a word, resting her small head against my arm for the rest of the meal. She did not say anything. She did not need to. Children sometimes understand kindness in a way adults have long since trained themselves out of. I thought about that moment often in the years that followed, whenever I needed a reason to keep showing up. Not for Robert, not for Paige, not even in the hardest years entirely for my mother, but for the particular uncomplicated loyalty of a little girl who had decided, without anyone teaching her to, that I was worth sitting beside. My father used to say something else, too, standing in that garage, sanding down the edges of another birdhouse roof that would never quite sell at the church craft fair he insisted on entering every single spring. "Quiet people get underestimated, Claire," he told me once, when I was maybe 16, complaining about a teacher who had passed me over for a class president nomination in favor of someone louder, someone who talked more and listened less. That's not a weakness. That's an advantage if you're patient enough to let it work for you. Loud people spend all their energy being seen. Quiet people spend their energy actually building something. I did not understand, at 16, how literally that advice would someday apply to my own life. I understood it perfectly, 9 years into caring for my mother, sitting in Daniel Ferris's waiting room for the first time, in a folder-lined office that smelled of dark wood and old paper, waiting to learn exactly what my father had quietly built without ever once telling me. That first meeting, the one 3 weeks after the phone call, was shorter and stranger than I expected. Daniel was a tall man in his 60s, silver-haired, with the kind of unhurried, deliberate movements that told you immediately he had spent a career choosing his words with enormous care. He pulled a thin folder from a locked file cabinet along the back wall of his office, set it on the desk between us without opening it, and studied me for a long moment before he spoke. "Your father sat exactly where you're sitting now," he said, "about 8 months before he passed. He was worried about something, Claire. He didn't tell me everything, not that day, but he told me enough. He asked me a question I have never forgotten. He asked me what happens, legally, when a family quietly decides one child matters less than the others, and that child spends years paying for it without anyone noticing." I felt my throat tighten at that, sitting in that office, understanding for the first time that my father had seen it coming even then, years before the nickname, years before the blocked number, years before any of the cruelty I had spent 9 years absorbing in silence. "What did you tell him?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I told him," Daniel said, folding his hands over the unopened folder, "that the law can only protect what gets documented, that good intentions don't hold up in court, but records do, contracts do, trusts do. I told him if he was worried about something like that happening to one of his children, the kindest thing he could do was make sure the paperwork existed before it was needed, not after." "He thanked me," Daniel said, "and he left. And about 8 months later, I read his obituary in the paper, and I assumed whatever he had been worried about had either resolved itself or had simply become one of those things families quietly bury along with the person who worried about it." "It did not resolve itself," I said quietly. "No," Daniel agreed. "It clearly did not." He did not open the folder that day. He told me, gently, that there were still things he needed to verify, conversations he was not yet at liberty to have, given the sensitivity of certain documents that involved my mother directly, and that he would be in touch once he had confirmed a few details. I left that office with more questions than answers, and a strange, unfamiliar feeling settling into my chest, something I had not felt in years, that maybe, somewhere in all of this, someone besides me had actually been paying attention. I did not tell Robert or Paige about that meeting. I did not tell anyone, except, eventually, Marisol, in one of our careful weekly calls about my mother's condition, and even then I only mentioned it in passing, unwilling yet to say out loud how much hope I had allowed myself to feel. Hope, I had learned over 9 years, was a dangerous thing to hand to a family that had spent so long teaching me not to expect anything from them at all. I preferred, in those early months of silence, to hold it quietly, privately, the way my father had once held his worry about me, without telling a single soul until the paperwork existed to back it up. But that thread would take months to fully pull, and in the meantime, my family assumed I had simply disappeared, exactly the way they expected me to. I should tell you about my mother's decline here, because it happened faster than any of us expected, and because it matters enormously to how everything eventually unfolded. Even before Thanksgiving, before the blocked number and the folded napkin and the cold walk to my car, Eleanor's dementia had been accelerating in ways the facility's care team had quietly started flagging in their monthly reports, the ones I had continued reading closely because, freeloader or not, I was still the one paying for them. By January, she was having what the staff called clarity windows, brief stretches, sometimes only 20 minutes, where her memory would sharpen almost to what it had been years earlier, followed by long hours of confusion and disorientation. I want to be honest with you about something. Even after everything, even after the blocked number and the humiliation and 9 years of being called a freeloader at my own family's table, I still called the facility every single week during those first months of no contact. Not to speak with my mother, but simply to ask the nursing staff how she was doing. And I never stopped the payments. The invoices kept arriving in my name, and I kept paying them, every single month of that silence, because the promise I made in that hospital hallway had been to my father, not to them. I simply stopped adding them to the folder. The ledger ended at 9 years, at that last Thanksgiving, because 9 years was the number they had earned. I never told Robert or Paige I was doing any of this. I never told anyone. They were the last threads of that old promise to my father that I could not quite bring myself to cut, even as I finally cut everything else. It was during one of those calls in early February that a nurse named Marisol Chen first introduced herself to me. She was warm in a way that felt genuine rather than professional, the kind of warmth that comes from someone who has spent years sitting with dying people and has decided, somewhere along the way, that kindness is not optional in that line of work. "Your mother talks about you sometimes," she told me that day, her voice careful, like she was handing me something fragile. During her clearer moments, she doesn't always remember the details right, but she remembers your name. She calls you her steady one. Her steady one. I sat with that phrase for a long time after we hung up. 9 years of being called a freeloader by everyone else in that family, and somewhere underneath the fog of dementia and the cruelty and the years of failing to defend me, my mother apparently still had one true thing left about me, buried in whatever was left of her mind. I did not tell Marisol about the family fracture. Not yet. I simply asked her to keep me updated, and she agreed, quietly, without asking why my brother's number was the one listed as primary contact on the facility's paperwork instead of mine, even though I was the one who had paid every bill for 9 years. That detail, small as it seemed at the time, would matter enormously later. Meanwhile, downtown, in a modest office with dark wood shelving and the particular quiet of a place where important, careful documents get signed, Daniel Ferris was reviewing a file that had been sitting largely untouched in his cabinet for almost 9 years. When I finally called him back in late February, after weeks of hesitating, he told me something that made me sit down very slowly in my kitchen chair. "Miss Whitfield," he said, "I have finished going through your father's file." He did not simply ask me to draft a few documents that afternoon. He asked me to keep a close eye on certain arrangements involving your mother's estate. I have to say, I am glad it was you who called. I asked him what he meant by that. He was careful in his answer, the way good attorneys always are, telling me only that there were matters that would need to be revisited, depending on how my mother's care situation evolved, and that he would be in touch when the time was appropriate. It was not much, but it was enough to plant something in me that had not been there before. Not hope, exactly. Something steadier than hope. A quiet certainty that my father had seen something coming, years before any of us did, and had tried, in his own careful way, to make sure it would not simply disappear. I want to pause here and tell you something honestly, because I think it matters. I did not go no contact as some kind of strategy. I was not sitting in my kitchen plotting revenge against my brother and sister. I left that Thanksgiving table because I could no longer stand at it and be diminished. The rest, the attorney, the ledger, everything that came after, unfolded because I finally, for the first time in 9 years, gave myself room to breathe and to think clearly instead of simply reacting to whatever cruelty came next. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply stop absorbing the blow and let the people who have been counting on your silence discover, slowly, what happens when it ends. By March, 4 months into the silence, I had settled into something that almost resembled peace. I had my job. I had my quiet evenings. I had the occasional weekend call with Marisol, brief and careful, checking in on my mother's condition without crossing any line I was not ready to cross. And once, only once, I had a text message that came through from an unknown number, a message I would not fully understand the significance of until much later. It was from Sophie. My niece, 16 years old by then, had apparently found a way around her father's efforts to keep the family narrative airtight. "Aunt Claire," the message read, "I don't care what Dad says. I miss you. Please don't disappear completely." I stared at that message for a long time before I finally typed back, "I would never disappear on you, sweetheart. I just needed some space from everyone else for a while." She sent back a single heart and nothing more, but it was enough. It told me that whatever else had broken in that family, one true thing had survived it. What none of them knew, not Robert with his self-satisfied blocked contact, not Paige with her eye rolls, not even my mother with her laughing insistence that I would come crawling back by Christmas, was that the quiet months of silence were not weakening me. They were the exact conditions under which everything I needed was slowly, carefully assembling itself. An attorney who had been waiting 9 years for my call. A nurse who trusted me more than she trusted the family member listed on the paperwork. A folder full of receipts that told a story no one could argue with. And a niece who had quietly decided that blood was not the same thing as loyalty. There was one more thing that happened during those quiet months, something I have thought about often in the years since, because it revealed more about my sister than almost anything else in 9 years combined. In the second week of March, an email arrived in my inbox from Paige, the subject line reading simply, "Checking in," the kind of deliberately casual phrasing designed to look harmless before you have even opened it. I read it twice before I let myself respond to anything in it, even in my own head. "Hey Claire," it began. "I know things have been weird, but I wanted to reach out. Mom's been asking about you a lot, and honestly, it's getting hard to manage everything without you around to help coordinate her care. Also, Grant and I have been talking, and we were wondering what your plans are for the house eventually, since it's just sitting there mostly empty. Anyway, hope you're doing okay. Miss you." I read that email standing at my kitchen counter, coffee going cold beside me, and I felt something harden in my chest that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with a very specific, very familiar disappointment. 3 sentences about missing me. 1 entire sentence asking what my plans were for a house that, at that point, still legally belonged to my mother, not to me and certainly not to Paige. I did not respond right away. I sat with it for 2 full days, drafting and deleting several versions of a reply, before I finally settled on something short, polite, and entirely uninformative. "I'm doing fine, thank you. I don't have anything to share about the house right now." I did not mention Daniel Ferris. I did not mention the letter I had found in my father's handwriting, or the yellow legal pad slowly filling with 9 years of careful math. I simply closed that particular door, gently, and let it stay closed. Paige never wrote back after that. I think, looking back, that single reply told her everything she actually needed to know, that whatever crack she had been hoping to find in my silence, some financial anxiety or loneliness she could use to pull me back into old patterns, simply was not there anymore. I want to be honest, though, because I promised myself when I started telling this story that I would be honest even about the parts that do not reflect particularly well on anyone, including me. Reading that email hurt more than I expected it to, not because of what Paige wanted, but because of what she did not want. In 3 sentences, reaching out to a sister she had not spoken to in 4 months, she found room to ask about a house, and no room at all to simply say she was sorry. That same week, on a gray Thursday afternoon that I remember mostly for the cold, steady drizzle that never quite turned into real rain, I drove out to the small cemetery on the edge of town where my father was buried. Something I had not done in almost a year, not since the previous spring, when the anniversary of his death had come around and I had gone alone, the way I always went, because no one else in the family ever seemed to remember the date without a reminder. I stood at his grave for a long time that afternoon, my coat collar turned up against the drizzle, reading his name carved into the gray stone. Frank Whitfield, beloved husband and father. And I found myself talking to him, quietly, the way I sometimes did in the years since he died, though I had never told anyone that, not even Sophie. "I found your letter," I told him, my voice barely audible over the soft patter of rain on the leaves overhead. "The one with Daniel Ferris's name on it. I don't know yet what it means, but I think you saw something coming, years before any of us did. And I think you tried to protect me even after you couldn't be here to do it yourself." I stood there a long while longer, letting the cold seep into my shoulders, thinking about a man who had spent a lifetime quietly building birdhouses that never quite sold, who had taught his daughter to write everything down, who had walked into a downtown office 8 months before his death and asked a careful, quiet question about what happens when a family decides one child matters less than the others. "I kept my promise," I told him finally, before I turned to walk back to my car. "I took care of her, even when it cost me almost everything I had, even when they made sure I knew, every single year, exactly how little it seemed to matter to anyone but me." I do not know if grief actually listens, in any way that matters, to the things we say over a headstone in the rain. But something in me felt lighter walking back to my car that afternoon. The particular lightness that comes from finally saying a hard truth out loud, even to someone who cannot answer. It was 2 days after that visit to the cemetery that Sophie sent me a photograph, unprompted, of a birdhouse she had built herself for a school art project, crooked and slightly lopsided in exactly the way my father's had always been, with a small handwritten note beneath it that read, "Grandpa would be proud, right?" I sat in my kitchen and cried at that photograph in a way I had not cried in months. Not out of sadness exactly, but out of something closer to gratitude. The particular, overwhelming gratitude of realizing that the one true thing my father had built, patience, steadiness, the quiet insistence on doing the careful work even when no one applauded you for it, had somehow, against every odd that 9 years of family cruelty had stacked against it, managed to skip a generation and land safely in someone who would carry it forward. I did not know yet, standing in my kitchen with that photograph glowing on my phone screen, exactly what Daniel Ferris's careful phrase, "a mechanism to make things right," would eventually reveal. I did not know that my mother had spent 5 years quietly visiting a downtown office under the pretense of a hair appointment she had told no one about. I only knew, with a certainty that had been building slowly since November, since a blocked phone number and a folded napkin and a cold walk to my car, that I was no longer the same woman who had spent 9 years absorbing every cruelty in silence, hoping quietly that eventually, someone would simply notice. They thought I had disappeared. What they did not understand yet was that I had simply gone still, the way you go still right before you finally understand exactly what needs to happen next. By April, 5 months into the silence, I had started meeting with Daniel Ferris more regularly, not because anything urgent had happened, but because he had suggested, gently, that it might be wise for me to understand my legal position given how long I had been the primary financial contributor to my mother's care. I remember sitting across from him in his office, a room that smelled faintly of old paper and coffee, while he explained something I had never fully considered. Under the laws of our state, a family member who has provided substantial, sustained financial support for an elderly parent's care, particularly when that support significantly exceeds any contribution from other heirs, can, under certain circumstances, have standing to raise claims against an estate, especially if that support was never intended as a gift. I never thought of it as a loan, I told him honestly. I just thought of it as taking care of my mother. I understand, he said, folding his hands on the desk in that careful, measured way he had. But your father did not think of it that way, Miss Whitfield. And frankly, neither did your mother once she understood the full picture. I remember leaning forward slightly in my chair. What do you mean, once she understood the full picture? He was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of an attorney weighing what he is and is not yet permitted to say. There are some documents, he said finally, that your mother executed several years ago during one of her clearer periods that I am not currently at liberty to discuss with you in detail, given attorney-client privilege matters that involve her directly. What I can tell you is that your father's original visit to my office was prompted by something specific he observed in this family, something about the way certain family members were treating you, even back then. He asked me to make sure that if things ever reached a certain point, there would be a mechanism in place to make things right. I believe your mother later revisited that mechanism herself. I sat in that office for a long moment, turning that phrase over in my mind. A mechanism to make things right. I did not fully understand yet what it meant, but I understood, with a certainty that settled into my chest like something solid, that my father had seen this coming, years before any of us, and that somewhere in the confusion of my mother's declining mind, some version of her had agreed with him. I drove home from that meeting with the phrase repeating itself in my head, over and over, the whole way down the highway. A mechanism to make things right. It was such a careful, lawyerly way to describe whatever my mother had done, and yet it settled into me with the weight of something enormous, something I could not yet see the shape of, but could already feel pressing against the edges of my life. I did not sleep well that night. I lay in bed running through every memory I had of my mother in the years since my father died, searching for some moment, some conversation that might explain when, exactly, she had gone somewhere quietly to revisit whatever mechanism my father had put in motion. It came to me 2 days later, while I was standing in my kitchen waiting for coffee to brew, so suddenly that I nearly dropped my mug. A Tuesday, 5 years earlier, when my mother had asked me, almost offhandedly, to drive her downtown for what she called a hair appointment, insisting she did not need me to come inside, that I should simply drop her at the curb and pick her up in an hour. I remembered thinking it was strange at the time, because my mother had gone to the same hairdresser for 20 years, a woman named Carol who worked out of a small shop 2 blocks from our childhood home, not downtown, not anywhere near the block where I had dropped her that day. I remembered the building too, now that I let myself really look at the memory instead of simply filing it away the way I had for 5 years. A modest brick office building with a dark green awning, 3 stories, the kind of unremarkable building that houses lawyers and accountants and dentists in every mid-sized town in the country. I had sat outside in my car for exactly 58 minutes, checking my phone, listening to the radio, never once suspecting that my mother, inside that building, might be doing something that would eventually determine the entire shape of the rest of my life. I called Daniel the next morning and asked him, carefully, without quite revealing how much I had already guessed, whether that appointment might have had anything to do with the documents he had mentioned. He was quiet for a long moment on the other end of the line, and then he said, in that measured way of his, "I am not able to confirm the specific date of any visit, Claire. But I will say this much. Your mother came to see me several times over the years, always alone, always without telling anyone in the family, including you. She was very particular about that. She said she did not want anyone to know, not even you, until she was certain of what she wanted to do. I sat with that for a long time after we hung up. 5 years. My mother had been quietly, deliberately working on something for 5 years, in secret, while the rest of the family called me a freeloader at every holiday table, and she had never once told me, never once let slip even the smallest hint that she saw what was happening and intended, eventually, to do something about it. I do not know, even now, exactly why she kept it from me for so long. Daniel offered a theory once, gently, over one of our later meetings, that perhaps she was afraid that if I knew, I would either grow resentful of continuing to carry the burden, or worse, that I would ease off entirely, assuming the matter had already been handled, and something in her needed me to keep showing up exactly the way I always had, unprompted, unrewarded, because that was the only way she could be certain the record she was quietly building would remain true. I do not know if that theory is fair to her. I have chosen, in the years since, to believe it is, because the alternative, that she simply did not trust me enough to tell me, is a harder thing to carry than I am willing to carry for the rest of my life. Back in early March, about a month before that April meeting where Daniel finally used the word freeloader out loud himself, I had begun, at his suggestion, formally organizing everything I had into something closer to a legal record than a private grief. He walked me through it patiently, over the course of 2 long afternoons in his office, teaching me things I had never needed to know before. How to properly document a gift versus a loan. How courts in our state weighed sustained, disproportionate caregiving when family members later disputed an estate. What the term unjust enrichment actually meant, and how it might apply to a sibling who had, for 9 years, benefited from someone else quietly absorbing an obligation that legally and morally belonged to all 3 of my parents' children equally. Think of it less like a lawsuit, Daniel told me, sliding a yellow legal pad across the desk toward me, and more like a timeline. I want you to write down every year, starting with the year your father passed. Next to each year, I want the total amount you contributed to your mother's care. And next to that, I want you to write down, as best you can remember, what your brother and sister contributed in that same year. I remember sitting there with that pad in front of me, pen hovering over the paper, and feeling something strange settle over me, a kind of grim, steady resolve that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with simply, finally, wanting the truth to exist somewhere outside of my own memory, where no one could later argue it away. Year 1. $61,000 from me, $400 from Robert, a check he wrote for my mother's birthday that year, which I remembered specifically because he had mentioned it at least 6 times over the following months, as though it balanced out everything else. Nothing from Paige. Year 2, $68,000 from me. Nothing from either of them. Year 3, the year of the compression stockings and the golf clubs. $72,200 from me, a single $100 gift card from Paige, given at Christmas, for a spa she said Mom might enjoy someday, though my mother's mobility had already declined too much by then to ever use it. I filled 3 full pages with that pad, year after year, the numbers climbing steadily on my side and staying nearly flat on theirs, and by the time I finished, my hand ached from writing, and my chest ached from something else entirely, something closer to grief than fury, though the two had become so tangled together by that point in my life that I rarely bothered trying to separate them anymore. Daniel reviewed the pages carefully when I finished, his expression unreadable in that careful attorney way. And then he looked up at me and said the words that I would carry with me for the rest of that spring. Words that mattered more to me, honestly, than anything the eventual trust or the will or the recording would ever say. "Claire," he said, "in nearly 40 years of practicing elder law, I have seen a great many families fall apart over exactly this kind of imbalance. What I do not see very often is someone who kept a record this careful, this honest, without ever once inflating it to make herself look better or her siblings look worse. This is not a document built out of spite. This is simply the truth, written down." I told him that afternoon about Marisol's phrase, her steady one, and how it had lodged itself somewhere deep in my chest months earlier. He nodded slowly, as though it confirmed something he had already suspected about the kind of daughter my mother had actually raised, underneath 9 years of a family narrative that insisted otherwise. It was in the last week of March, with those 3 pages still spread across my kitchen table, that Sophie called me for the first time, rather than texting, her voice small and a little uncertain on the other end of the line. "I hope it's okay that I'm calling," she said. "I just wanted to hear your voice instead of typing everything." We talked for almost an hour that night, about nothing important, about a school project she was working on, about a book she was reading that reminded her of the stories I used to tell about my father's birdhouses. She did not ask about the family fracture, and I did not bring it up. But there was something steadying about simply hearing her laugh again, unguarded, the way she used to laugh before she got old enough to understand how carefully everyone else in that family had learned to measure their words. Before we hung up that night, she said something that stayed with me for weeks afterward. "Grandma still asks about you," she said quietly. "I heard her ask my dad once, when she thought I wasn't listening. She asked him when you were coming back. He told her you were busy. I don't think that's true, Aunt Claire. I think you're just tired of being the only one who shows up." I did not correct her. There was nothing to correct. A 16-year-old girl had, in one quiet sentence on a phone call in late March, understood something about our family that the adults in it had spent 9 years refusing to see. By the time April arrived, and Daniel finally sat across from me and said the words that would not entirely leave my chest for weeks, "This is not the record of a freeloader. This is the record of the only person in this family who showed up," I had already spent a full month sitting with the shape of my own history laid out in careful columns on a yellow legal pad. I was not surprised by what he said. I had already done the math myself, alone, at my kitchen table, more times than I could count. But hearing it from someone else, someone with no reason to flatter me, no family loyalty pulling him toward kindness, made it real in a way that 9 years of my own private certainty never quite had. I want to be clear about something here, because it matters to the shape of this story. I did not spend those months plotting to take anything from my brother or my sister. I never once asked Daniel Ferris to help me claim more than what was fair. What I asked him, again and again, in every meeting, was simply to help me understand what fair actually looked like, after 9 years of being told that caring for my own mother made me a freeloader, while the 2 people who contributed nothing were treated as the reasonable, generous, appropriately busy ones. There is a particular kind of clarity that comes from finally being believed. Daniel Ferris was the first person outside of myself in 9 years who looked at my ledger, my folder full of invoices and wire transfers, and said, without hesitation, "This is not the record of a freeloader, Miss Whitfield. This is the record of the only person in this family who showed up. I will not pretend that sentence did not undo me a little. Sitting there in his office in April, 9 years after the word freeloader first got attached to my name. Sometimes the thing you need most is not revenge. It is simply someone with authority finally naming what actually happened. Around that same time, Marisol called me with an update that shifted something in my chest. My mother's clarity windows, once brief but frequent, had started narrowing. The doctors were beginning to use language that families dread. Words like decline trajectory and care plan adjustments. The clinical vocabulary hospitals and facilities use to soften the fact that someone you love is running out of time. I don't know how much longer those clear moments are going to last, Marisol told me gently. If there's anything you want to say to her, anything you need her to hear from you directly, I would not wait too long. I did not go see her. Not yet. I want to be honest about that, because it was not an easy decision. And I do not think it was a perfect one. Some part of me was still standing in that dining room, hearing her laugh, hearing her tell me I would be back begging by Christmas. I was not ready to walk back into that facility and hand her the satisfaction of thinking she had been right. So instead, I did something else. I asked Daniel Ferris to help me formally document everything. Every payment, every year, every conversation I could remember about being called a freeloader. Not as an act of cruelty, but as an act of truth-telling. The kind I had denied myself for 9 years out of some misguided sense of family loyalty. By May, 6 months into the silence, I had built something I never expected to build. A complete, meticulously organized record of 9 years of sole financial responsibility for my mother's care. Cross-referenced against Robert and Paige's near-total absence from that responsibility. All of it reviewed and confirmed by an attorney who had been quietly waiting, on my father's instructions, for exactly this moment. I did not know yet what I would do with it. I only knew that for the first time since my father died, I was no longer simply absorbing whatever happened to me. I was prepared for whatever happened next. I had no idea how soon that preparation would matter. It was a Tuesday morning in June, a little over 6 months after I walked out of Paige's house, when my phone buzzed twice against the kitchen counter with a voicemail from Brookhaven's main line. And Marisol's voice came through it, careful and warm, and heavier than I had ever heard it. "Claire, it's Marisol, calling from Brookhaven. It's about your mother. Eleanor has been moved to hospice care. She's been asking for you, specifically by name. There's something she wants you to help her finish, and she asked me to make sure you heard it from her, not from anyone else in the family. I think you should come as soon as you can." I do not remember deciding to drive there. I remember, somehow, already being in my car, my hands steady on the wheel in a way that surprised me, given how badly my chest was shaking underneath. 6 months of silence, and now this. 6 months of building myself back into someone whole, and now a voice on the phone telling me my mother needed me, specifically, by name, urgently, in a way that had nothing to do with an invoice or a payment or a family dinner where I would once again be the punchline. I want to tell you honestly what went through my mind on that drive, because I think it matters more than anything else in this story. I was not thinking about the folder. I was not thinking about Daniel Ferris or mechanisms to make things right, or $685,000 in unreimbursed care. I was thinking about a man clearing leaves out of a gutter on a Sunday morning 9 years ago, and a promise I made to him in a hospital hallway that smelled like bleach. I was thinking about a woman who used to sing off-key in the kitchen while she made Sunday breakfast, before the dementia, before the decline, before any of us understood how quickly a person could become someone else entirely. Whatever else my mother had done, whatever cruelty she had allowed or participated in over those 9 years, she was still my mother. And she was dying. And she was asking for me. When I arrived at Brookhaven, Marisol met me in the lobby before I even reached the front desk, her expression careful in a way that told me she had been watching that door since she left the message, not simply following protocol, but because there was something she needed to prepare me for. "Before you go in," she said quietly, guiding me toward a small family consultation room instead of straight to my mother's suite. "There's something I need to explain, and someone I need you to speak with first." Sitting in that small, quiet room, with soft gray walls and a box of tissues on the table that told its own story about how many families had sat exactly where I was sitting, was Daniel Ferris. He stood when I walked in, his expression careful, almost gentle. "Claire," he said, "your mother called my office 3 days ago. She had a lucid period, a long one, longer than she's had in months, and she asked her care team to help her reach me directly. She asked me to come here, to Brookhaven, to finalize something she started years ago and never quite completed." "Finalize what?" I asked, though some part of me, some quiet, careful part that had been assembling itself for 6 months, already suspected the shape of the answer. "Your mother," Daniel said, "executed a set of estate documents 4 years ago. A revocable trust, along with an amendment to her will. She did this during a period of clarity that her physician at the time formally documented, which means anyone challenging them on the basis of incapacity would be arguing against her own doctor's contemporaneous finding. She asked me at the time to hold them privately, without informing your brother or sister, because she said she wanted to see how things played out first. I believe, given everything that has happened over the last 6 months, she has now seen enough." I sat very still, my hands folded tightly in my lap, waiting for him to continue. "The trust," he said, "names you as sole trustee and primary beneficiary of her estate, including the house on Larkspur Lane, her remaining investment accounts, and a life insurance policy your father originally set up. Your brother and sister are named as beneficiaries of a modest fixed distribution, $25,000 each, with the explicit condition, in her own words, quoted directly in the document, that this reflects, and I am reading this exactly as written, my recognition that only one of my children ever showed up." For a moment, I could not make myself speak. I simply stared at Daniel, at the leather folder open on the small table between us, at the careful, unhurried way he had just handed me an entire decade of buried truth in a single sentence. 4 years, I finally managed. A year after I dropped her at that curb for a hair appointment she never had. She did this 4 years ago. Why didn't she ever say anything? Why let it sit locked away in your office all this time, while everything at home just kept getting worse? Daniel folded his hands on top of the folder, the way he always did when he was choosing his next words with particular care. I asked her something similar myself, The day she came in to finalize the amendment, he said. She told me she was not ready yet to have that conversation with your brother and sister. She said if she told them while she was still healthy enough to argue about it, it would become a fight. And fights, in her experience, only ever seemed to end with you being the one who apologized first, even when you had done nothing wrong. I felt something tighten in my throat at that. It was such a precise description of 9 years of my own life that I almost laughed. The strange, brittle kind of laugh that comes out sideways when something is too true to simply cry about. What exactly does the trust cover? I asked, needing something concrete to hold on to, the way I had needed concrete numbers for 9 years, ever since my father first taught me that nothing counted unless it was written down. Daniel opened the folder fully now, turning it so I could see the top page, dense with formal legal language I recognized only in fragments. Revocable living trust, grantor, successor trustee. The house on Larkspur Lane transfers to you outright, he said. Free and clear, since your mother paid off the mortgage almost 15 years ago. It's currently appraised at just over $400,000, though that figure is a few years old, and the market has moved since then, so it may be worth somewhat more now. He turned a page. There are 2 investment accounts, a conservative bond fund and a smaller brokerage account your father originally opened. Combined value approximately $310,000 as of the most recent statement, and it is out of those accounts that the distributions she set aside are funded. And there is a life insurance policy, again, originally your father's, structured as a 20-year term policy he converted to permanent coverage the year before he passed, worth $150,000, with the trust named as its beneficiary. He converted it, I repeated slowly. Before he died. You said he came to see you about 8 months before he passed. Daniel nodded. He did. I believe, though I cannot say this with absolute certainty since he never stated it outright, that converting that policy and the conversation we had about protecting you were not unrelated. Your father was a careful man, Claire. He did not do things by accident, and he certainly did not spend money changing an insurance structure without a specific reason in mind. I sat with that for a moment, picturing my father sitting in this exact office, in this exact chair perhaps, quietly rearranging the pieces of his own legacy to protect a daughter he must have already suspected would need protecting, years before any of the cruelty had fully revealed itself. Did he know, I asked quietly, what they would eventually call me? The word they used? No, Daniel said gently. I do not believe he lived to hear that particular word used against you. But I think he understood the shape of the pattern well enough, even in its early stages, to know where it was likely headed if no one intervened. Some people do not need to see the whole storm to know one is coming. They simply feel the pressure change in the air, and they act accordingly. I looked down at the folder again, at the careful legal language describing a house, 2 accounts, an insurance policy, $400,000, $310,000, $150,000. Numbers that added up to something close to $860,000, an amount that felt, sitting there in that quiet room, almost obscene next to the number I had already spent 9 years memorizing. $685,000 given, not as an inheritance, but simply as the ordinary, unacknowledged cost of loving someone the rest of the family had decided was no longer worth the trouble. There's something else you should understand, Daniel continued, his voice steady but careful, the way it always was when he was about to say something he knew would land heavily. The $25,000 named for your brother and sister was not an arbitrary figure. Your mother specifically asked me to calculate it based on what she called a fair minimum, an amount that would ensure neither of them could later claim she had cut them out entirely, while still making unmistakably clear, in the language of the document itself, that their contribution to her care had been minimal to non-existent. She wanted the imbalance to be impossible to misread. Not cruel, just impossible to misread. I thought of every Thanksgiving, every offhand comment about golf clubs and vacations and empty little lives. Every time I had absorbed the word freeloader, like weather I could not control. And I understood, sitting there, that my mother had spent 4 years quietly constructing the one thing 9 years of my own silent suffering had never managed to produce. Undeniable proof. I do not think I fully breathed while he was speaking. 4 years. My mother had known, for 4 years, exactly what was happening in that family, and had quietly, deliberately, without telling any of us, decided to make it right. Not out of guilt, necessarily. Perhaps out of something closer to clarity, the kind that sometimes comes even through the fog of a declining mind, when a person finally sees clearly who has actually been standing beside them all along. "There's one more thing," Daniel said, and here his voice softened even further. "Your mother recorded something. About 3 weeks ago, before her condition worsened. She asked the facility's chaplain to help her, and she asked that it be played, in full, in front of your brother and sister once the estate matters were finalized. She was very specific about that. In front of them, not privately. She said, and again I am quoting her directly, they need to hear it the way they made her hear it for 9 years, in front of everyone." I put my hand over my mouth. 9 years of being humiliated at family dinners, in front of everyone, and my mother, in whatever clarity she had left, had understood exactly what that meant, and exactly what kind of ending it deserved. "Can I see her?" I finally asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Marisol nodded gently. "She's been waiting for you," she said. "She's been asking every hour since she woke up this morning. She wants to hold your hand, Claire. That's actually the thing she asked me to make sure I told you, word for word. She wants to hold her steady one's hand one more time while she still can." I walked down that hallway toward my mother's hospice room with Daniel Ferris's words still settling into my chest. 4 years of secret planning, a recorded message waiting to detonate everything my brother and sister believed about their own place in this family. And underneath all of it, the simplest, most devastating truth of all. My mother was dying, and in whatever time she had left, she wanted, more than anything, to finally tell the truth. They had no idea, sitting comfortably in their own homes that morning, going about their ordinary Tuesday, that everything they had spent 9 years building on top of my silence was about to come apart, all at once, in front of everyone, exactly the way they had once done to me. My mother's hospice room was small and quiet, lit by soft afternoon light coming through a single window that looked out over a modest courtyard garden. And when I walked in, she was propped up against a stack of pillows, thinner than I remembered, her hands resting on top of the blanket like 2 small, fragile birds. She turned her head when the door opened, and for one long, terrifying moment, I was not sure whether she would recognize me at all. Then her face changed, softened, and she said my name, clearly, steadily, the way she used to say it when I was a child running through the kitchen door after school. "Claire, there you are." I sat beside her bed and took her hand, and it was smaller than I remembered, the skin thin and papery, but her grip was surprisingly firm. "I'm here, Mom," I said, and my voice cracked on the second word in a way I could not control. "I'm here." For a long moment, neither of us said anything at all. I simply sat there, holding her hand, letting my eyes adjust to the room the way you adjust to a photograph of someone you love taken years after the picture you remember. There was a small vase of yellow tulips on the windowsill, slightly wilted, and a folded quilt at the foot of the bed that I recognized immediately, the one my mother had kept draped over the back of the living room sofa for as long as I could remember. Faded now, the stitching along one corner starting to come loose. Someone had brought it from the house for her. I found out later it had been Marisol, who had driven to Larkspur Lane herself on a day off, using a spare key my mother had given the facility years earlier, because she said a woman should not have to die under a blanket that did not smell like her own home. I noticed, too, a small framed photograph propped on the rolling tray table beside her bed, one I did not recognize at first, until I leaned closer and realized it was a picture Sophie must have sent, printed at some drugstore kiosk and mailed in an envelope, judging by the slight curl still left in the paper. It showed the three of us, my mother, Sophie, and me, taken years earlier at a 4th of July gathering, long before any of the cruelty had fully taken root, my mother laughing at something just out of frame, Sophie perched on my hip even though she had been far too big by then to be carried. I asked my mother about it, my voice still unsteady, and she smiled faintly, her eyes drifting toward the photograph. "Sophie sent that to me a few weeks ago," she said. "She wrote on the back of the envelope in case I forgot who everyone was. She's a good girl, that one. Better than any of us deserve, the way we all behaved." I did not say anything to that. I simply squeezed her hand a little tighter, and she squeezed back. Weaker than I remembered, but present, undeniably present, in a way that made the 6 months of silence between us feel, for one strange moment, like something that had happened to two entirely different people. Marisol came in quietly a few minutes later to check my mother's vitals, moving with the practiced gentleness of someone who has learned exactly how much space grief needs in a room like that one. She adjusted the drip on an IV pole beside the bed, made a small note on a chart, and glanced at me with an expression that was equal parts encouragement and warning. The look of someone who knew, better than either my mother or I did in that moment, exactly how much time might actually be left. "I'll give you two some privacy," she said softly. "I'll be right outside if you need anything. Take your time." She paused at the door, looked back once, and added, so quietly I almost missed it, "She's been more like herself today than she has been in weeks, Claire. I don't know how long that will last. I would use it if I were you." I understood exactly what she meant. I had spent 6 months building a case, a ledger, a legal record of 9 years of exactly how much I had given and exactly how little had ever been asked of anyone else. And none of it, not one single page of it, mattered even slightly compared to the fact that my mother was lying in a hospice bed with maybe days left. And I still had the chance, right then, to simply be her daughter instead of her creditor. "I used to hold your hand like this when you were small," my mother said, once Marisol's footsteps had faded down the hallway, her thumb moving slowly across my knuckles the way it had when I was a child afraid of thunderstorms. "Do you remember that? You used to crawl into bed with your father and me during the bad ones, and I would hold your hand until you fell back asleep. You were always the one who woke up first when the thunder started. Robert used to sleep right through it, Paige too, but you always woke up." I did remember. I had not thought about those nights in years, but sitting there in that hospice room, the memory came back whole and vivid. The smell of my mother's hand lotion, the particular warmth of my parents' bed, the low, rolling sound of thunder over our old house on Larkspur Lane. "I think that's just who you always were," my mother continued, her voice growing a little stronger now, as though the memory itself were feeding something back into her. "The one who noticed things first. The one who woke up. I used to think that made you anxious, sensitive, maybe a little too serious for your own good. It took me far too long to understand it actually just meant you were paying attention, the whole time, to things the rest of us were sleeping straight through." Her eyes glistened, and for a moment she looked past me, toward the window, toward the soft gray light falling over the courtyard garden outside. "I have had a great deal of time to think these last few months," she said. "More time than I would have liked, honestly, lying here with nothing to do but think. And I keep coming back to the same conclusion, over and over. You were awake the whole time, Claire. For 9 years, you were the only one of my children who was actually awake." I did not trust my voice enough to respond right away. I simply sat there, holding her hand, letting the quiet stretch out between us the way it used to on those old thunderstorm nights, waiting for whatever came next without trying to rush it. My mother closed her eyes for a moment, and I thought, with a small jolt of fear, that she might be drifting, that the clarity might already be slipping the way Marisol had warned it eventually would. But then her grip tightened again, deliberate and certain, and when she opened her eyes, they were sharper than they had been even a few minutes earlier, fixed directly on mine with an intensity that startled me. "I know what I said," she told me, before I could say anything else, her eyes suddenly sharp and clear in a way that startled me after months of hearing about her decline. "At Thanksgiving, I know what I let them do to you all those years. I let them call you that terrible word, and I laughed along with it more times than I want to admit, and I am asking you now, while I still have the words to say it clearly, to forgive me for that." Her voice trembled on the last few words, and I felt something in my chest crack open. 9 years of hurt, finally meeting 9 years of a mother's quiet, delayed reckoning. "You don't have to do this now," I told her gently, squeezing her hand. "You don't have to apologize for anything right now. Just rest." "No," she said, with a firmness that reminded me, suddenly and painfully, of the mother I remembered from before the diagnosis, before the decline, before any of us understood how quickly a person could slip away. "I have been resting for months, Claire. I do not have time left to keep resting on this. I need you to know that I saw it. I saw all of it. Every bill you paid, every holiday you drove me to appointments while your brother posted pictures of himself on vacation. Every time they called you that word and I let it sit at my table like it belonged there." "I saw it," she said again, softer this time. "And 4 years ago, I finally decided to do something about it." I told her that Daniel had explained the documents to me, gently, carefully, and she nodded, her eyes filling with tears that did not quite fall. "I wanted to tell you sooner," she said, "but I was afraid. Afraid of what your brother would do. Afraid of losing what little relationship I still had with Paige. Afraid, honestly, of admitting to myself how badly I had failed you, for 9 years, by staying silent while they hurt you. I am done being afraid now," she said. "There isn't enough time left to be afraid anymore." We sat together for a long while after that, not talking about trusts or documents or anything Daniel Ferris had explained in that small consultation room. We talked about my father, about the way he used to whistle off-key while mowing the lawn, about Sophie, who my mother lit up at the mention of, asking me twice, in the space of 10 minutes, whether Sophie still liked the stories about her grandfather's birdhouses. We talked about nothing important and everything important, the way you do when you finally understand that time is the only currency that actually matters. Before I left that evening, my mother asked me one more thing. her hand tightening around mine with what strength she had left. "When the time comes," she said, "and Daniel plays that recording for your brother and sister, I need you to promise me something. I need you to hear it too, all the way through, even the hard parts. And I need you to promise me you will not let it turn you cold. You have spent 9 years being called something you never were. Do not spend the rest of your life becoming the thing they accused you of, or worse, becoming something colder than what they were. Be better than they were to you. That is the only inheritance that actually matters." I promised her. I meant it. And 3 days later, in the early morning hours, with Marisol at her side and a soft rain falling against the courtyard window, my mother passed away peacefully, holding, according to the nurse who called me at dawn, a small photograph of my father that she had kept on her nightstand since the day she moved into that facility. I sat with that news for a long time before I called anyone else. Before I called Robert, whose number I discovered still showed as blocked on my end from the reciprocal action I had taken months earlier, requiring me to send the message through Daniel Ferris's office instead. A strange, formal way to tell your own brother that your mother had died. Before I called Paige, who answered on the second ring and immediately, before I could even finish the sentence, began asking questions about the house, about the accounts, about what happens next. Questions that told me, with brutal clarity, exactly what she had been thinking about even in the middle of grief. I did not tell either of them about the trust. I did not tell them about the recording waiting in Daniel Ferris's office, or about the mechanism my father had set in motion 9 years earlier, and my mother had quietly completed 4 years ago. I simply told them the service would be small, private, and that Daniel Ferris would be in touch about estate matters in the days following. They had no idea what those words actually meant. They would find out soon enough, in front of everyone, exactly the way my mother had insisted. The service itself was small, exactly as my mother would have wanted, held on a bright, unexpectedly warm morning in late June at a modest chapel not far from Brookhaven, the kind of place with simple wooden pews and stained glass windows that scattered soft color across the floor whenever the sun moved. I stood at the front, next to a framed photograph of my mother from years earlier, before the dementia, smiling in a way I had almost forgotten she was capable of, and I delivered a eulogy that I had rewritten 4 times the night before, trying to find a way to honor a woman who had both failed me and, in the end, tried desperately to make it right. Robert and Vanessa sat in the second row, dressed in the kind of understated black that still somehow managed to look expensive. Paige and Grant sat beside them, Paige dabbing carefully at the corners of her eyes with a tissue, in a way that struck me, uncharitably perhaps, as more performance than grief. And in the row behind them, quiet and steady, sat Sophie, 16 years old, dressed simply, watching me the entire time with an expression I recognized immediately, because I had worn it myself years earlier, watching adults fail someone who deserved better. I spoke about my father's birdhouses and my mother's off-key singing, and the particular kind of steadiness she had before her decline, when she used to sit at our kitchen table doing crossword puzzles every Sunday morning while the coffee brewed. I did not mention Thanksgiving. I did not mention the word freeloader, or the blocked phone number, or $685,000 in unreimbursed care. That was not what that room needed to hear, not yet. But I looked, more than once, directly at Robert while I spoke about steadiness, about what it actually means to show up for someone, and I watched something flicker uncomfortably behind his eyes each time. After the service, as the small crowd of my mother's old friends and neighbors filtered out into the bright June sunlight, Daniel Ferris approached me quietly and said, "I've arranged for the family to meet at my office tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock, to go over your mother's estate. I've already sent the notice to Robert and Paige. I did not tell them any details beyond the time and location. "Are you ready for this?" he asked. And I appreciated that he asked it as a real question, not a formality. "I don't know if ready is the right word," I told him honestly. But I made her a promise. She wanted them to hear it in front of everyone, the way they made me hear their cruelty for 9 years. I intend to keep that promise, even if it isn't comfortable. That night, I sat alone in my apartment with the folder open on my kitchen table one more time. 9 years of invoices spread out in careful rows. And I thought about my mother's last words to me. Do not let it turn you cold. Do not become the thing they accused you of, or worse, something colder than what they were. I did not know exactly what tomorrow would bring, but I knew, sitting there in the quiet of my own kitchen, that whatever happened in that office, I intended to walk out of it exactly as steady as I had walked in. Not cruel, not gloating, simply, finally, undeniably, the person who had been telling the truth all along. I had no idea how completely that steadiness would end up dismantling everything they thought they still had. Daniel Ferris's office the next morning felt smaller than I remembered. Or perhaps it simply felt smaller because of who was sitting in it. Robert arrived first, in an expensive gray suit that seemed almost aggressively casual for a meeting about our mother's death. Vanessa beside him, in dark sunglasses she did not remove even indoors. Paige and Grant arrived a few minutes later. Paige's eyes red-rimmed in a way that, this time, looked genuinely raw rather than performed. Though I noted, uncharitably perhaps, that her first words upon sitting down were not about our mother at all, but a question directed at Daniel about whether the meeting would take long, since Grant had a call at noon. I sat across the table from all 4 of them, Daniel Ferris at the head, a leather folder squared neatly in front of him, and a small digital recorder placed deliberately in the center of the table. Robert noticed it first. "What's that for?" he asked, his voice carrying that particular blend of suspicion and irritation I remembered so well from 9 years of family dinners. "Your mother," Daniel said calmly, "left specific instructions for how this meeting should proceed. I intend to honor them exactly. Before we discuss the terms of her estate, there is something she recorded before she died that she asked to be played for all 3 of you together." Paige's expression shifted, uncertainty creeping into it for the first time. "A recording? Mom recorded something?" "She did," Daniel said, "and she was very specific that it be played in full, without interruption, before we proceed to the legal documents." He pressed a button on the small recorder, and the room fell into a silence so complete I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning overhead. For a long moment, nobody in that room moved. I remember the particular quality of that silence, thick and expectant, the kind of silence that exists right before a storm breaks, when the air itself seems to be holding its breath. Robert's leg had gone still under the table, his hand resting on his knee in a way that looked deliberately casual and was anything but. Paige had reached for Grant's hand without seeming to realize she had done it, her knuckles pale where she gripped his fingers. Even Vanessa, who had spent the entire meeting so far behind her dark sunglasses, had gone rigid in her chair, as though some part of her already understood, before a single word played, that whatever was coming would not be kind to any of us. I found myself thinking, in those last seconds of silence, about the small room at Brookhaven where that recording had actually been made, 3 weeks before my mother died, though I would not learn the full story of that afternoon until Marisol told me about it much later, over coffee, long after everything in Daniel's office had already unfolded. My mother had asked for the facility's chaplain, a soft-spoken man named Reverend Alan Whitcomb, who had been visiting her twice a week for months by then, mostly just to sit with her, sometimes to pray, more often simply to listen. According to Marisol, my mother told him plainly, on a Tuesday afternoon in mid-May, that she needed his help with something important, something she did not trust her own hands to manage alone anymore, since the tremor in them had grown bad enough by then that she could no longer hold a pen steady for more than a sentence or two. Marisol said the recording took nearly 2 hours to make, not because my mother rambled, but because she kept stopping, gathering herself, asking Reverend Whitcomb to play back what she had already said so she could be certain it captured exactly what she meant. She was terrified of getting it wrong, Marisol told me. Not wrong in the sense of the facts. She had those memorized. Every dollar amount, every year. She made me help her check them against your file more than once. She was terrified of getting the tone wrong. She kept saying, "I don't want to sound cruel. I just want them to finally hear the truth." I think about that often. The image of my mother, weeks from death, her hands trembling too badly to write, insisting on doing this one final, difficult thing exactly right. Not out of anger, but out of some last, urgent need to finally tell the truth clearly, after 9 years of letting it sit crooked and unspoken at every family table she ever hosted. Reverend Whitcomb, Marisol told me, had asked my mother once, gently, whether she was certain she wanted it played in front of everyone, together, rather than privately, or perhaps not at all. My mother had apparently gone quiet for a long moment before answering him, and when she did, her voice had been steadier than it had been in weeks. "They embarrassed my daughter in front of this whole family for 9 years," she told him. "I let it happen. I am not going to let her carry that shame alone for one more day, and I am not going to let them hear the truth quietly, in private, where they can talk themselves out of it before they even leave the room. They need witnesses. They need each other, sitting right there, unable to look away." Sitting in Daniel Ferris's office, watching that small silver recorder rest in the exact center of the table, none of us yet knowing precisely what it held, I understood, with a kind of quiet, aching clarity, that my mother had thought through every detail of this moment with more care and more courage than she had managed to summon in 9 years of Thanksgiving dinners combined. I looked across the table at Robert, whose jaw was still tight, whose eyes kept flicking toward the recorder and then away again, as though he could somehow will it not to speak. I looked at Paige, whose composure had already started to crack even before a single word had played, her mascara smudging faintly at the corner of one eye. And I looked, finally, at Daniel, whose expression had settled into the careful, patient stillness of a man who had done this exact kind of difficult work many times before, who understood, better than any of us in that room, that some truths could only ever be delivered once, and had to be delivered completely, without softening, or they would never truly land at all. I thought, too, in those final seconds before the recording began, about my father, and the quiet conversation he must have had with Daniel 9 years earlier. A conversation born not out of suspicion exactly, but out of the particular, careful worry of a man who loved his family enough to notice, even from a distance, the shape of a pattern before it had fully formed. I thought about the letter I had found folded into thirds in the back of an accordion file, about a hairdresser appointment that was never really a hairdresser appointment, about a yellow legal pad filled with careful columns of numbers that told a story no one in that family had ever wanted to hear out loud. Every piece of it, I realized, sitting there in that small, silent office, had been leading toward this exact moment, toward a room with 4 chairs on one side of a mahogany table, and my mother's voice waiting, patiently, to finally say what 9 years of silence had never allowed her to say to my siblings' faces. Daniel's hand hovered near the small recorder for one final second, and I remember thinking, absurdly, that it looked almost like a held breath made physical, a tiny machine about to release something none of us in that room could take back once it was spoken. Robert cleared his throat, as if to say something, some final protest or deflection, but no words came. Paige simply stared at the recorder, her whole body gone very still, the way you go still right before you understand that whatever happens next is going to change something permanently. And I sat there, my hands folded tightly in my lap, my mother's promise to me still echoing somewhere in the back of my mind. Do not let it turn you cold. And I found myself holding my breath without quite meaning to, bracing for the sound of her voice, for whatever truth she had spent her final, clear weeks so carefully, so deliberately, deciding to finally tell. My mother's voice, when it finally came through the small speaker, was weaker than I remembered from her healthier years, but steady, deliberate. The voice of a woman who had clearly thought carefully about exactly what she wanted to say. If you are hearing this, the recording began, then I am gone, and Daniel has done exactly what I asked him to do. I want to start by saying I loved all 3 of my children. That has never once been in question, not for a single day of my life. A pause, the faint sound of a shaky breath being drawn in. But loving someone and being honest about them are 2 different things, and I spent far too many years choosing love over honesty, at the cost of the one child who never once asked me to choose. Robert shifted in his chair. Paige's hand had gone still against the table. For 9 years, my mother's recorded voice continued, Claire paid for every single thing I needed. Every bill, every appointment, every increase in my care costs, every medication, every single month, without fail, without complaint, and without ever once asking either of you to share the burden equally, even though she had every right to. And for 9 years, I watched the 2 of you call her a freeloader. I watched you mock her at my own dinner table. I laughed along, more times than I am proud of, because it was easier than admitting what that word actually meant, coming from people who had put $500 between them into 9 years of my care. Vanessa had gone very still beside Robert. Paige's tissue sat forgotten in her lap. So let me be very clear, my mother's voice went on, gaining a strength that startled even me, hearing it again in that quiet office. The freeloader in this family was never Claire. Freeloading is what you do when you take without giving. Freeloading is enjoying the comfort of a well-cared-for mother while contributing nothing to that care, and then insulting the one person who made that comfort possible. If either of you would like to know what freeloading actually looks like, I invite you to review the financial records Daniel has. Records that show, in exact dollar amounts, $500 between the 2 of you over 9 years, while your sister quietly paid $685,000 to keep me safe, fed, and cared for. The silence in that room after those words was unlike anything I had ever experienced. Robert's jaw had tightened into something rigid. Paige had started crying in earnest now, not the careful, performed tears from the funeral, but something raw, something that looked, for the first time in 9 years, like actual shame. "I have made my decisions accordingly," my mother's voice continued, softer now, winding toward its end. "Daniel will explain the details. I know it will not feel fair to some of you. I ask you to sit with that feeling for a while before you decide it is unfair, because I sat with a much harder version of that same feeling for 9 years, watching what I allowed to happen to my daughter. And I do not regret for one single moment finally choosing to make it right." "Claire," the recording said, her voice breaking slightly on my name. "You were never the freeloader. You were the only one who ever showed up. I am sorry it took me so long to say that out loud, in front of everyone, the way you deserved to hear it years ago. I love you. I am proud of you. And I am, finally, at peace." The recording clicked off. For a long moment, no one in that room said anything at all. Robert broke the silence first, his voice tight, almost strangled. "This is insane," he said. "She wasn't well. Everyone knows she had dementia. This can't possibly hold up. This has to be some kind of coerced statement, I imagine you were going to say," Daniel Ferris interjected calmly, sliding a folder across the table. "I anticipated that concern. Attached here is documentation from your mother's treating physician, dated the same week this recording was made, formally certifying that she was of sound mind and full decision-making capacity at the time. I also have similar certification from 4 years ago, when the underlying trust and will amendment were originally executed. A challenge would be expensive, public, and, in my professional judgment, very unlikely to succeed, Mr. Whitfield. I would strongly advise against pursuing one." "This is unbelievable," Paige said, her voice climbing toward hysteria, mascara now running freely down her cheeks. 9 years, and she never said a single word to us, not once, and now we're just supposed to sit here and— "She said a word to you at every single family dinner for 9 years, I said quietly, the first thing I had said since sitting down. My voice was steady, steadier than I expected, exactly the way I had promised my mother it would be. She said, more or less, that you and Robert should keep doing exactly what you were doing, and she laughed along while you did it. What changed was that she finally stopped being afraid to tell the truth about what that actually cost." Robert turned toward me, his face flushed with something between fury and disbelief. "You did this," he said. "You manipulated her. At the end, when she was vulnerable, you convinced her to—" "I did not speak to our mother about her estate a single time before her final week," I said, cutting him off, my voice still level, still calm, exactly the composed operator my mother had asked me to remain. "I have not spoken to either of you at all in 6 months, Robert, because you blocked my number, on purpose, in front of everyone, to prove a point. I would like you to sit with that fact for a moment before you accuse me of manipulating anyone." Daniel Ferris cleared his throat gently and opened the folder in front of him. "Given the tenor of this conversation," he said, "I think it's time we simply walk through the terms clearly, so there is no confusion about what is and is not being asked of anyone." They had no idea, sitting there in stunned, unraveling silence, that the hardest part of that meeting had not even started yet. Daniel Ferris walked through the trust documents methodically, the way I imagine he had walked hundreds of families through similar moments over the years. His voice calm and unhurried, even as Robert's leg bounced restlessly under the table, and Paige's crying slowly gave way to a kind of stunned, exhausted silence. The house on Larkspur Lane, appraised at just over $400,000, passed to me outright, along with what remained of my mother's investment accounts, once the distributions she had set aside were carved out. Roughly $210,000, and a life insurance policy my father had originally purchased decades earlier, worth an additional $150,000. All of it structured, Daniel explained, specifically to reimburse and honor the 9 years of care I had provided, above and beyond what any inheritance would typically represent. Robert and Paige were each named to receive $25,000, structured as a fixed distribution rather than a percentage share, with the specific written condition read aloud by Daniel in a measured, unemotional voice. In recognition that only one of my children provided consistent care and financial support over the final 9 years of my life, and in the hope that this distribution, though modest, encourages reflection rather than resentment. $25,000, Paige repeated, her voice hollow. That's it? After everything, that's what we get? You get $25,000 you did nothing to earn, I said. And I want to be honest. There was an edge in my voice now that I did not entirely try to soften. I get a house and accounts I paid into, quite literally, for 9 years, in the form of every single bill that kept our mother alive and comfortable. I am not sure what part of that feels unfair to you, Paige, but I would encourage you to do the math before you decide. Robert was quiet for a long moment, staring down at the table, and when he finally spoke, some of the fury had drained out of his voice, replaced by something smaller, more uncertain. I didn't know it was that much, he said quietly. The $685,000. I never actually looked at what it added up to. I told myself you had the money to spare, that you didn't have kids to save for, that it made sense for it to fall on you. I did not have money to spare, Robert, I said, my voice softening slightly, not out of forgiveness exactly, but out of something closer to exhaustion with 9 years of anger finally being allowed to settle. I had a savings account I drained twice. I had a retirement contribution I paused for 3 straight years. I had a life I quietly shrank around the edges, every single month, because I made a promise to our father, and because I loved our mother, even when it was hard, even when the two of you made it harder than it needed to be. Vanessa, who had said almost nothing throughout the entire meeting, finally spoke, her voice smaller than I had ever heard it. I'm sorry, she said, not quite looking at me, for what I said at that barbecue years ago, about your life being empty. That was cruel, and I knew it was cruel when I said it, and I said it anyway because it got a laugh. I did not respond to that immediately. Some apologies deserve silence before they deserve forgiveness, and I let that one sit in the room for a moment before I simply nodded, once, acknowledging it without absolving it. Daniel closed the folder gently. There is one more provision, he said, that your mother was specific about, and I want to make sure it is clearly understood before we conclude. He looked at me. She established a separate education fund, $50,000, designated specifically for Sophie Whitfield, to be administered by you, Claire, as trustee for college expenses. She wanted to make sure that whatever happened between the adults in this family, the one grandchild who never once treated you unkindly, would be protected and provided for. I felt my throat tighten unexpectedly at that. My mother, even in the fog of her final months, even in the midst of finally reckoning with 9 years of her own complicity, had thought carefully about Sophie, had made sure that the one bright, loyal thread in that family would be protected, no matter how everything else unraveled. Robert put his face in his hands. When he looked up again, his eyes were wet in a way I had genuinely never seen before, not once, in 43 years of being his sister. "I don't know how to fix this," he said quietly. 9 years of calling you that, in front of everyone, and I don't even know where to start. "You start," I said, "by understanding that this was never actually about the money. It was about being seen. For 9 years, all I wanted from either of you was one single acknowledgement that what I was doing mattered, that it cost me something, that it deserved something better than a nickname thrown around at Thanksgiving. You didn't give me that when it would have cost you nothing. Do not expect me to hand you absolution now, just because it would make you feel better." The room was quiet for a long moment after that. Paige was still crying, quietly now, and Robert sat with his hands folded, staring at the table like a man trying to recalculate everything he had believed about himself for 9 years. I stood up, gathered my copy of the documents Daniel slid across the table, and looked at both of them one final time. "I am not interested in punishing either of you further," I said. "That was never who I wanted to be, and it is not who our mother asked me to become. But I am also not interested in pretending the last 9 years did not happen. If either of you wants a relationship with me going forward, it starts with actually reckoning with what you did, not simply being embarrassed that a recording forced you to hear it out loud." They had no answer for that, not that day, and I did not wait around to see if they would eventually find one. The weeks after that meeting moved slower than I expected, in the particular way that grief does once the sharp edges of a funeral and a legal reckoning have passed, and all that is left is the quiet, ordinary work of rebuilding a life. I moved back into the house on Larkspur Lane in late July, not because I needed the space, but because it felt important to reclaim something my family had spent years assuming would eventually belong to someone more deserving than me. I stood in my father's old workshop the first weekend I was there, surrounded by half-finished birdhouses he had never gotten around to completing, and I let myself cry, finally, fully, in a way I had not allowed myself since the hospital hallway 9 years earlier. Sophie came to visit 2 weeks later, on her own, having asked her father directly whether she could see me, a request Robert apparently agreed to without argument, a small, quiet sign that something in him had genuinely shifted since that meeting in Daniel Ferris's office. She walked through the front door of the house she had spent so many childhood holidays in, looked around at the familiar rooms, and said, simply, "It feels like Grandpa's still here." I told her he was, in every birdhouse in that workshop, in every crooked shelf he had built with his own 2 hands, in the promise I had made him and finally, fully kept. I want to tell you what happened to Robert and Paige because I think it matters, and because I think it complicates the story in a way that feels more honest than a simple, clean villain's collapse. Paige did not reach out again for almost 4 months, and when she finally did, it was a short, careful letter, handwritten, apologizing not just for Thanksgiving, not just for 9 years of the word freeloader, but for a specific memory she said had haunted her since that meeting, a moment when I had offered, years earlier, to help pay for her daughter's braces because Grant's business had hit a rough patch, and she had told her friends afterward, laughing, that I was just trying to buy her family's approval. She wrote that she had thought about that moment more than any other since the recording played, because it was the clearest evidence, she said, that I had never once been trying to buy anything. I had simply been trying to help, the way I always had, and she had turned even that into a joke at my expense. I wrote her back. Not a full reconciliation, not yet, perhaps not ever entirely, but an honest letter acknowledging that people can change if they are willing to actually sit with the damage they caused rather than simply feeling bad about being caught. We have coffee now, occasionally, careful and a little formal still, but real. Robert took longer, much longer. It was nearly a year before he called, using a new number since I had, understandably, never unblocked the old one. And when I finally answered, his first words were simply, "I don't expect you to forgive me. I just wanted you to know I finally understand what I did." We are not close. I do not know if we ever will be again. Not in the way siblings are supposed to be close. But he sends a card on my birthday now, and last Christmas he asked, carefully, almost shyly, whether he could see the house sometime, to remember our father in it. The education fund for Sophie grew steadily over the following year, and when she left for college the following fall, I drove her there myself, her father's blessing quiet but genuine behind the decision, and I stood in her dorm room doorway and told her that her grandmother, in the end, had made absolutely sure she would be taken care of, no matter what happened to the rest of us. Sophie hugged me tightly before I left and said, "You were always the one who showed up, Aunt Claire, for me and for Grandma. I just wanted you to know I saw it, even when I was too young to say so." I still work the same job, though I have scaled back my hours slightly, no longer needing to absorb the financial weight I once carried in silence for 9 years. I still keep a folder, though it holds different things now: photographs of Sophie's college move-in day, letters from Paige, the occasional card from Robert. I think about my mother often, not the version of her who laughed along with cruelty at a dinner table, but the version who spent her final clear weeks quietly making sure the truth would finally be told, in front of everyone, exactly the way she owed it to me. I think sometimes about that word, freeloader, and how strange it is that the people who used it most freely were the ones who never once understood its actual meaning. I was never the one taking without giving. I was simply the one who gave without ever once being asked to, and for 9 years, that generosity was mistaken for weakness, my quiet devotion mistaken for a lack of anything better to do with my life. I know now that was never true. I had plenty else I could have done with those 9 years. I chose, every single month, to show up instead. Because that is what love looks like when it is real, whether or not anyone ever bothers to notice. If there is a lesson in any of this, and I have had a long time now to sit with what that lesson actually is, it is this. The people who call you a freeloader, while you are the only one paying the bills, are rarely confused about the truth. They know exactly what you are doing for them. What they are actually doing, when they use a word like that, is testing whether you will keep absorbing it in silence, because your silence is what makes their comfort possible. The moment you stop absorbing it, the moment you set down your napkin and walk to the front hall for your coat, is the moment they finally have to reckon with the truth they have been avoiding all along. Sometimes that reckoning takes 6 months. Sometimes it takes a voicemail from a hospice room, and a recording no one expected, and a folder full of 9 years of receipts that finally speak for themselves. I do not regret those 9 years, even the painful parts, even the word that followed me through every family gathering like a shadow I could not shake. I do not regret them because they taught me something I could not have learned any other way. That my worth was never dependent on being recognized by people who had already decided, long before I ever proved otherwise, exactly who I was allowed to be in their eyes. What I regret, if anything, is how long it took me to understand that walking away was not abandonment. It was, finally, the truest form of love I had left to give myself. Have you ever been the one in your family who quietly carried everyone else? only to be the one they turned around and blamed? I would love to hear your story, in your own words, in the comments below. And if this story meant something to you, if any part of it reminded you of your own steady, quiet strength, I would be so grateful if you would take a moment to like this video and subscribe, so more stories like this one can find their way to the people who need them most. Somewhere, in a workshop full of half-finished birdhouses, I still hear my father whistling off-key. And somewhere in the quiet of a house on Larkspur Lane that finally, truly belongs to me, I still hear my mother's voice, steady and clear in that final recording, telling me, at last, exactly what I had always deserved to hear. You were never the freeloader. You were the only one who ever showed up. And in the end, that was worth more than everything they ever tried to take from me.